I'm Jacob Shiba, and welcome to Watershed Wise Basics. A little bit about me. I'm an associate professor of water technology at Palomar College in California, teaching a variety of classes in water technology, water distribution, and water conservation. I was also a community affairs specialist and a water efficiency representative, planning various water education programs. I've coordinated public outreach events, REBIT programs to promote water conservation, and more. I have a BS and MS in environmental sciences, and I've been a G3 certified professional since 2017. Oh, and I love gardening. Well, enough about me. Let's get started. So welcome to the Watershed Wise Landscaping class, where today we will be building a puzzle throughout the next 60 minutes of how do you create a watershed wise landscape. We're going to start by remembering our climate. The second part, we're going to then look at taking a watershed approach. Then we're going to talk about the foundation of our landscape, growing a healthy living soil sponge. Then we're going to shift to plants. We're going to look at the right plant in the right place. We're going to talk about using rainwater as a resource. Then we're going to switch to managing our irrigation, and we're going to end with our landscape management. With that, let's jump into the first piece of this puzzle, remembering your climate. Now, depending on where you live, you're going to live in a very specific climate zone. Depending on anywhere throughout the United States, you see there are big groups of climate zones. And how do we determine these climate zones? Well, they're based on a variety of factors, including temperature, humidity, precipitation, seasonality, differences in elevation, latitude, and ocean influence. So it's really important that you determine what type of climate you live in. That's going to have a great impact on how you plan for your new landscape. Now, the biggest change in this presentation is not necessarily outside in your landscape, but it's between our ears. And that is a sort of a paradigm shift where we're really going to be looking at things like how do we regenerate our soils with, say, adding mulch? What types of plants are we choosing to put in those landscapes? And then, of course, how are we changing the irrigation in which we manage these landscapes? So I encourage you to continue to watch this webinar with an open mind as we kind of shift away from traditional landscape paradigms. So let's shift quickly here to the second piece of this puzzle, and that is about taking a watershed approach. Now, in order to talk about this approach, we do need to address what is a watershed. Well, as defined by the US EPA, a watershed is an area of land where all the water that falls onto this land drains to the same place. And we typically think of our watersheds as these big sprawling landscapes from mountains to rivers, rivers eventually running down into oceans. But we really want to think about watersheds on a much smaller scale, as you're going to see here in the next few slides. Now, when we talk about watersheds, we're talking about a balanced watershed. This is the type of watershed we see out in nature, where we have clouds that form over this landscape. These clouds get bigger, they get heavier. Eventually, that water condenses and forms precipitation, they most commonly in the form of rain or snow. Now, when that rain comes down to our landscape, like you can see on the right side of this graphic, it has the opportunity to interact with the landscape. And so any trees we have, shrubs, bushes, grasses, mulch, that all intercepts that rain. It helps to slow that rain down as it then trickles down and makes its way onto the soil surface. Once that rain is on the soil surface, that water can then infiltrate into the ground. That's what we want. We want that water to infiltrate into the ground so that that water can be utilized by, say, our plants, the different microorganisms that live in the soil, and really any other organisms that need that water. Now, that water, as it infiltrates down through the soil, that soil also acts as a filter. It's a very important part of our natural watershed, our natural water cycle. That soil helps to filter out that rainwater. Now, if we get enough water infiltrating into our soil, then we get a process called percolation, where that water actually travels deeper and deeper down through the soil and gets to what we call the water table. That helps to recharge the groundwater, which is water deep below the surface, which we use as a very important source of drinking water all throughout the United States and really all throughout the world. Now, water that's infiltrated into the soil, some of that water is going to be used by plants. It's going to make its way back into the atmosphere through a process of evaporation. Some of that water, though, is going to flow horizontally and make its way into streams, rivers, eventually into oceans. So now that the sun comes up, starts to shine again over our watershed, this water that's available in the soil, this water available in our rivers, lakes, oceans, evaporates back into the sky to again form clouds. And this cycle repeats. And this is what we see out in a balanced watershed and really in a natural watershed. But unfortunately, our landscapes don't look like that. They look more like this. So they are very imbalanced, completely unsustainable, covered in concrete, covered in fake grass, and all sorts of materials that don't allow for that natural process of water cycling that we see in this balanced watershed. Now, the beauty of the watershed approach is that we can convert any landscape from a traditional landscape to a watershed wise landscape. And we're going to do that by treating every property as its own little mini watershed, right? Rather than this big sprawling mountains, rivers, and everything, we're just going to look at your property and we're going to treat your property as a mini watershed. And in this conventional landscape where all the rain that falls onto this landscape, we've designed it to basically get rid of that water as quickly as possible. So that normally the front yard is graded to sheet the water off into the flood control system so that the water that falls on the roof goes to the downspouts off to the driveway or into the curbside drain and gone and on its way out. Well, in this conventional landscape, we have really poor quality compacted soils. We end up with depleted aquifers. It becomes very difficult to have happy, healthy plants. And so what we want to do is convert all of these traditional or these conventional landscapes to what we call a watershed wise landscape. And the beauty of this is we can do it to any landscape by following 4 principles. I'm going to touch on each of these right now, and we're going to dive into greater detail on each of these 4 principles for the remainder of today's presentation. So the first principle here is the foundation for any landscape, and that is about growing a healthy living soil sponge. We're going to talk about all about how you do that. So once we've grown this healthy living soil sponge, then we want to make sure we're passively capturing rainwater as a resource, right? This soil sponge is going to allow for better absorption, but we want to make sure we're contouring the landscape in order to capture that rainwater as a resource, say with a simple swale. The third principle here is about the plants we choose. We want to select plants that are what we call climate appropriate. These are going to be plants that are going to be happy and healthy based on where you live, based on what climate you live in. A lot of these are going to be native to your region and to your area. The fourth principle is that if you're going to use irrigation, we want to do it as efficiently as possible and only when necessary. All right, so let's dive deeper into these 4 principles. So the first is the foundation for your landscape, and that's growing a healthy living soil sponge. Now, creating this soil sponge is essential for healthy landscapes. And the reason we call it a sponge is because it acts like a sponge. And well, if you look at this chunk of dirt here, this chunk of soil, it even looks like a sponge. Its porous material allows water in, holds that water, and then allows water to slowly drain out into our plants, into the rest of our landscape. You can see the healthy roots running through this ball of soil. You can even see a nice big earthworm across here. So creating this living soil sponge is essential for our healthy landscapes. Well, how do we do this? Well, we can create this living soil sponge by maintaining the following 3 components, or growing what we call a soil owl. And those 3 components are oxygen, water, and life. And so by maintaining these 3 components throughout your landscape, this helps to get you through dry times as well as through wet times, helps to create that healthy living soil sponge that contributes to this sustainable landscape that we're trying to grow. Now, the beauty of this landscape is that plants are in control of their own environment. And so what do we mean by that? Well, inside the soil, there are billions of different microbes that we're going to talk about in just a second here. But these microbes form this, what we call soil party. And this soil party is actually cultivated by the plants themselves. So if you look at the tree in this image here, it's capturing infrared radiation, right? Solar radiation from the sun. It's taking that and converting that energy to then be able to form simple sugars. So it's pulling CO2 out of the air, it's pulling water from the root system, and that's how it's able to grow its bark. It's how it's able to get bigger, grow leaves. It's how it's able to flower. Now, while we always look at what's going on above the surface of the soil when it comes to these plants, there's even more going on down below. And so in what we call the root zone of this plant, we're pulling that CO2 from the air and we're actually sequestering that carbon into the soil. We're storing it there. And these roots in the soil are actually forming what we call a symbiotic relationship, a multi-beneficial relationship between these soil microorganisms and between the plant. And this becomes an exchange of goods and services where we're exchanging things like nutrients, water, antibiotics, and the plant or the tree is in control of this environment. And the plant fosters this relationship. And this is essential for creating that healthy living soil sponge. Now, I mentioned there's a soil party going on. Well, in 1 teaspoon of healthy garden soil, there are billions of microbes. And this is something that's more recently been discovered. So think about that. A teaspoon of garden soil has more microbes than there are humans on this earth. And it's these microbes that help to create this soil sponge that also help to mine the nutrients so our plants can survive and thrive for years and years and years. Let's take a look at this soil party. Now, the first guest to arrive in our landscape or a soil party is going to be the bacteria. And so they are either already existing in our landscape and we just need to add water to wake them up, or they arrive and they arrive via some taxi. They don't have feet, they can't move around. So they arrive via some taxi. Maybe it's a dropped leaf from a tree or blades of grass from the neighbor's lawn or from, say, a dog dropping a little present on your lawn. Well, this bacteria makes its way into your landscape. Once they're woken up, they then become very hungry. And what do? They eat and they decompose various types of organic matter, say that leaf that was dropped and crunched onto your landscape. Now, these bacteria, they cannot release. In other words, they don't poop. So what do? They eat, and they grow, and they reproduce, and they grow, and they reproduce. And you get this large bacteria, remember, beneficial bacteria, now populating your landscape. Well, once this bacteria arrives, this encourages our second guest to arrive, and that's going to be the protozoa. Now, the protozoa love to eat bacteria. And if you look at that electron microscope image there, bacteria have little hair-like appendages called flagella. This allows them to swim around. And so these bacteria start to swim around through our landscape and start to eat bacteria. And as they consume this bacteria, the nutrients that release are now available in our soil. But it's important, though, that the form of these nutrients are not quite in a form that's usable by our plants yet. So we're slowly starting this nutrient cycle. We've got this landscape now where we've got a population of beneficial bacteria and protozoa that are starting to thrive. Well, this then encourages our next guest to arrive, and that's going to be our nematodes. So nematodes, most of them are beneficial. There can be some that are detrimental, but most are beneficial. They love to eat bacteria and protozoa, and they swim vigorously through the landscape in doing so. And as they consume this bacteria and this protozoa, their excrements are now in a form of nutrient that for the first time are available to our plants. So now that we have this leaf that's been dropped onto our landscape, that's crunched up, that's consumed by the bacteria, then protozoa, then nematodes, these nutrients then can be again utilized by this tree. And this is really the start of this nutrient cycle. So now we start to build up the quality of the soil and we start to get some next guest who arrives. Well, who's that next guest? It's going to be an uninvited guest. It's going to be our weeds. Right? So in a natural landscape, the weeds come and they grow and they die and they have this very short life cycle. And in doing so, they slowly build up the amount of organic matter available in our soil, and therefore the quality of our soil improves over time. Now, we don't want weeds in our landscape, and we don't have decades to wait for this to occur. So what do? We're going to bring our own pizza to this soil party in order to jumpstart it. And we're going to do that in the form of organic matter, typically in the form of compost. Once we do this, this then really kickstarts our party where now the fungi arrive. And the fungi then form what we call this fungal network. This network allows for the roots of our plant to expand far beyond just their existing depths. It allows them to create a network that connects plants of the same species, plants of different species. It allows them to have access to resources such as water and nutrients far wider and far deeper. This fungal network, if you will, is then what allows for that exchange of goods and services that we talked about as plants are in control of this environment. Another really important feature of fungi is that they are great decomposers of different woody materials that a lot of bacteria cannot decompose. So once the fungi arrive, we start to form this fungal network. Now we've really got a soil party going on. And then, of course, our larger bugs, such as our macroarthropods, your pill bugs, your roly-polies, your silverfish, your earthworms, your ladybugs, these are all going to start to appear in your landscape. And once you start to see these macroarthropods, this is a great indicator that you've started to build this healthy, living, breathing soil sponge. Now, this good soil biology also helps to build a defense shield around our plant. It also helps this plant to better sequester water, to get us through those times of drought, for example, that we see all throughout the United States. I also want to mention this defense shield it builds. If you think about all the bacteria that fall from the leaves of our plant, if we leave those leaves, those nutrients then have the opportunity to break down to go back into the soil. That beneficial bacteria stays on site. It helps to improve, if you will, the immune system of our plants, the same way that we have beneficial bacteria in our gut microbiome. So building up soil biology really helps our plants in just so many different ways to be resilient to all the different detriments out there that really try to come into our landscape. The beauty of this soil sponge, right, this getting back to nature, is that we are replacing our traditional fertilizers, our so-called NPKs, which is our nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. We're replacing these fertilizers with our soil owl, our oxygen, our water, and life in this soil party. If you look at your natural landscapes, they look beautiful. They're green, they're lush, they flower, they provide all the benefits that we enjoy. We're not out there fertilizing them, right? We are trying to get away from fertilizers in our landscape and get back to this watershed wise approach, this sustainable approach. Now, if you do add fertilizers to your landscape, your plants are going to be happy, right? These fertilizers have nutrients that are in forms that are readily available to your plants. Now, aside from the fact that creating these fertilizers is a very, very environmental intensive process, chemical intensive, lots of byproducts, produces lots of greenhouse gas emissions. Aside from all that, when you give these plants, you spoon feed them these nutrients, they no longer cultivate the relationship with the soil party. And when they don't cultivate that relationship, you're decreasing the resiliency of these plants to survive and thrive. Right? So that is why we're going to shift away from fertilizers and we're going to go with this soil owl, oxygen, water, and life. So how do we do this? How do we create this living, breathing soil sponge? As we mentioned earlier, we're going to bring organic matter to this party, and we're going to do that in the form of compost. We're going to use this compost to feed the microbes and the microorganisms and let those microorganisms then feed the plants. So let's get compost into our soil, and we're going to put mulch on top. Now, these two terms, sometimes kind of used interchangeably, are actually very different. So compost, which we're using as a soil amendment to go into our soil, is completely decomposed organic matter, that image on the left there. We want to see a nice dark color. We want to have a nice kind of rich, earthy smell. We cannot tell if this was a banana peel, an eggshell, or a leaf in its past life because it all sort of looks the same. This is what we're going to add to the soil to boost microbial activity and to also increase our moisture holding capacity, right? To be able to hold on to more water. Now, mulch, on the other hand, is not decomposed. It is vegetation. It looks like whatever it was, bark from a tree, crushed up leaves. We want to take this natural mulch. We want to use it as a soil cover. Now, using it as a soil cover helps us threefold. It's going to help us to keep out the weeds and keep out the grass that might try to grow back. It's going to help hold moisture into the soil. This mulch is also going to break down over time to continue to provide nutrients to feed that soil party. So compost into the soil and mulch on top. And that is how we're going to grow this healthy living soil sponge in addition to our plants. Now, one of the things you can do is you can actually make your own compost. So look into creating a compost pile or getting one of those rotating compost bins. You can also make other forms of organic matter, such as worm castings. If you're interested in that, you can look up vermiculture. Vermiculture can be done indoors. It can be done outdoors on a much, much smaller scale. And worm castings are some of the most nutritious forms of organic matter that we can put into our landscape. I put worm castings onto my own landscape probably once a year, especially those potted plants and the patch of grass we have in the backyard for the kiddos. And we also encourage you lastly here to unskip the weed fabric. Weed fabric does a really good job at creating a barrier between the soil and everything above it. So what it does is it limits that nutrient exchange that we talked about. Weed fabric is also really good, as you can see in this photo, at growing weeds. And anyone who's had weed fabric, you know that it gets exposed, it rips, it actually gets full of weeds, and you have with this ugly kind of flapping weed kind of fisted fabric that starts to grow, and you got to pull it out and replace it all the time. So skip the weed fabric. Compost into the soil, mulch, mulch, mulch on top. All right, let's jump into the fourth piece of our puzzle, and that is selecting the right plant and putting it in the right place. Before we do that, though, we have to talk about the idea of evapotranspiration, ET, as we like to call it for short. Now, evapotranspiration is just a fancy word for two words smushed together. The first is evaporation. This is water that's lost from the surface of the soil, right? Sun comes out, shines on the soil dries out. The second part here is transpiration, and that may be a new term for some of us. Transpiration is the amount of water lost through the plant itself. We can think of it like plant sweat, if you will, right? So this tree in this image here pulls water up from the roots. That water travels all throughout the plant for all those important processes, and then it leaves the plant from the underneath the leaves and evaporates back into the environment. So this fancy term evapotranspiration, really what it tells us is how much water a plant needs to be happy and healthy. And we typically express this in terms of inches per year. Now, diving a little bit deeper into transpiration here, I mentioned transpiration is like plant sweat. So if we look at the image on the left here, this represents our high water plants, our high ET plants. This is typically going to be our cool season grasses. For a cool season grasses, let's say a tall fescue, when that sun comes out, this cool season grass is very unhappy. So what is it going to do? It's going to sweat a lot. And so in order to cool itself down, it sweats and sweats and sweats. That means it's pulling lots and lots of water out of the soil, which means we're going to have to replace that water much more frequently. Cool season grasses typically have a very shallow root zone, which I'll show you in the next slide, which has a great impact on the quality of soil, the impact on that, as well as that water holding capacity. Now here on the right, we have an example of what we call a low water user, our low ET plants. These plants have a lot of different adaptations so that when that sun comes out, these plants are actually very happy. Some of them sweat just a little bit, or some of them don't sweat at all. And so because they're not transpiring a lot, they're not pulling a lot of water out of the soil. Therefore, we don't have to water them as frequently, or maybe we don't have to irrigate them at all. Now, in order to then go select the types of plants that you appropriate for your landscape, you want to keep this idea of evapotranspiration in mind. So I mentioned that cool season grass is what we call a high water user. So depending on which area you live in, it varies of how many inches of water you're required per year throughout the United States or even throughout the world. But know that this is the biggest water user. So when you're out there looking at new plants to choose, if you see plants that are moderate or medium water users, right away they're going to use half the amount of water that that cool season grass does. Now, when it comes to selecting plants that are low and very low water users, these are going to be best when creating a low water landscape. Most of these low and very low plants are going to be plants that are native to your area, plants that are adapted to your climate. So when you're out there choosing plants, keep in mind this idea of how much water these plants are going to use. Is this plant that you're going to have to irrigate for the rest of its life? Or is this a plant that once established, it's going to be able to thrive off of just the amount of rainfall that we get in a normal year? Now, it's important to figure out your particular ET or how much water plants need in your particular regions. So this is one great tool provided by the EPA, specifically from their WaterSense program, that allows you to calculate and find your own water budget. This link is going to be available in the handout along with this presentation as well. Another thing you can look up is this National Plant Database. This is from the US Department of Agriculture. This link again will be provided in that handout, but you can go into and look for plants within this database to figure out how much water these plants are going to require. Are they medium, low, or very low water users? Are they going to do well in your specific regions? Now, there's national databases like this, but the best databases are those that are going to be local. So look for your local databases, your local resources, your local native plant societies, your local gardening guidebooks to figure out what plants are climate appropriate, specifically tailored to your region, regardless of where you live. Now, By selecting these plants that are climate appropriate, we've checked off the first box. The second box we need to check off though is we want to make sure we're putting these plants in the right place. And so we want to group plants together based on similar soil needs, similar water needs, and similar sun exposure needs. And so by grouping these plants in communities, we're helping them to thrive. We're going to increase our chances of garden success. So that's what we want to do. We want to group them in communities of similar needs by soil type, water need, and sun exposure. Another thing to consider when you're selecting where you want to put these plants is your hydrozones. Now, what we mean by hydrozone, we mean that we are grouping plants of similar water need together. So in this example, we've got 4 different hydrozones. The first is going to be our lawn. It's our grass. This is the cool season grass, so it's a high water user. It's an area of full sun, and it's being watered with, say, spray sprinklers. If we look at that compared to our hydrozone 4, we've got an edible garden. Now, our edible is also a high water user. So you're thinking maybe we can group these together. High water user, high water user. However, we're watering our edible garden by hand. We're watering our lawn by spray sprinkler. So we want to have these separated based on the methods of irrigation. Then if we look at our zones 2 and 3, we see that we've got native plants. We want to make sure those native plants, which are going to be low water users, we need to make sure those are separated from, say, our edible garden or from our lawn. In this particular example, these native hydrozones are being also watered by drip. So woohoo, kudos for extra irrigation efficiency there. Another thing to do in your landscape is to increase your biodiversity of your plants. So the more different types of plants you can put into your landscape, the more resilient your landscape is going to be to, say, things like invasive species, to invasive pests, and to even things like, say, drought, for example. And increasing the diversity of these plants in your landscape also has a great impact on what's happening below that soil surface, because all of these different plants have different style roots. Thicker roots, thinner roots, tap roots. And as these root systems grow deeper and grow wider, they allow for that plant to have greater access to resources such as, say, water and nutrients. Now, remember that these roots also help to create that healthy living soil sponge. Where we look at some of our native plants, we are going to create a healthy living soil sponge that's 13, 14, 15 feet deep. Right? And it's the depth of those roots that's going to dramatically increase the resiliency of that plant and the resiliency of our entire landscape. Now, that area below the surface of the soil where plant roots exist is essential for holding on to rainwater. It's what we call the green water zone. This is the area where this water is stored. This is the area that water is going to be allowed to percolate down into much easier, holding onto that water throughout the rainy season, but into spring and even into summer as well. Remember that when that sun comes back out, it's this water in the green zone that the plants use. It's that water that's transpired back out into the atmosphere that's going to help to create more clouds and help to bring more rain, which is essential for our landscapes. Another thing you can do in your landscape is plant more trees. A lot of times we see trees, we think of trees being big, high water users. Well, most trees, once established, are really not going to need supplemental watering during normal wet years. The benefits of these trees, though, is that they help to shade our gardens. And so when we help to shade our gardens, the rest of that landscape is going to use less water because of that shade, because of those cooler temperatures. Trees also help to increase the value of our property. They help to cool our homes down, decreasing our energy costs. They provide an essential habitat. They create wind blocks, sound barriers. They help to clean the air. They capture large amounts of carbon. Trees just provide so many benefits to our landscape. So one thing you can do in your landscape to improve it is plant more trees. Of course, though, when you're selecting trees, you want to make sure you're selecting the right ones. So certain trees roots grow very deep. Some of them grow more shallow. Some of them spread out very far. So make sure you know how big the tree is going to get and where those roots are going to grow, so you can size that tree appropriately based on the area that you're going to plant that tree. Another consideration with trees is you don't want to be too close to your house. You also don't want to be too close to the foundation. So we recommend a minimum of 10 feet from where you're planting a tree to the foundation of your home. You also want to really consider what's going on with water as it moves throughout that landscape, as remember that those tree roots are going to, for the most part, want to kind of grow out and chase that water. So where you're sinking that water is going to help to kind of encourage that root growth, which is why we encourage deep, infrequent waterings, which we'll talk about in the irrigation section. Another thing to think about with your shrubs, your larger shrubs, your trees, is that if you live in an area where you have to have fire resistance in mind, maybe you live on an urban wildlife interface, the bigger the slope that your trees are on, the farther apart those trees need to be. So if you're on a flat slope relatively, you can space trees, say 10, 20 feet apart. But as that slope tends to increase, you want to space those trees further and further apart to kind of decrease the chances of what we call a fire ladder, where where fire can kind of spread and hop from one type of vegetation to the next as it gets closer to your home. So really consider landscape spacing for fire resistance if you live on a slope and you live in that urban wildlife interface. And even lawn can be improved. You don't necessarily have to remove it. You can improve your existing lawn by letting it grow higher. Setting a mow height of 4 inches and letting the grass grow for longer allows for those roots to grow deeper. You want to make sure you're aerating your grass, throwing compost on it instead of any of those pesticides and fertilizers. You want to dethatch it at least once a year and add biodiversity, right? Overseed with clover, add some yarrow, create more of a natural lawn, if you will. That's going to improve biodiversity. It's going to decrease the amount of irrigation needed, and it's still going to be this beautiful, functional lawn, quote unquote, with of course quotes in there. The next piece of this puzzle is utilizing rainwater as a resource. Now, when it does rain, we throw a lot of this water away because of the way we built out our landscapes. We built out our urban environments. And so the reason all this water gets thrown away is because of what we call impermeable surfaces. These are surfaces that water cannot get through to get into the soil surface. So when you look at this conventional landscape here, what do you think the impermeable surfaces are? Now, as you look about, hopefully you're thinking, okay, the sidewalk, definitely, right? That's an impermeable surface. The driveway, for example. The roof, that's the one thing in this landscape that we don't want, right? Water getting through. We want that to be impermeable. Well, there are some few other things that may not be so obvious. So anywhere where we've got compacted turf can absorb a tiny bit of water, but then after that, we really think of it as being impermeable. Any kind of bare dirt areas, unmulched areas, those are all considered impermeable as well. They absorb a tiny, tiny bit of water, and the rest of that water essentially just runs off. Another thing I want to point out in this landscape is all the water falling on that roof is being collected in the rain gutter, but that downspout is delivering that water to the driveway. So all that water is being flushed away into the storm control system. It's gone and off our property. That's our water. That's water that's free that we do not have to pay for to put into our landscape. Now, when water does leave our landscape, it picks up a lot of different pollutants and it makes its way into our streets, our alleys, any of that flood control system, and it picks up a lot of pollution, things that we can see, like right here, the trash, the cigarette butts, the plastic, but it also picks up a lot of toxic chemicals that we don't see. The pesticides, the fertilizers, the herbicides, any kind of dog poop, bird poop, animal poop, all the different stuff that comes from our cars, like the toxic brake dust, tire dust, all those different microplastics. The rain picks up all this pollution and it flushes it into our flood control systems. During these big major floods, it can overwhelm these flood control systems, right? This causes flooding in dramatic different parts that can ruin infrastructure, ruin homes and businesses and schools. All of this pollution then makes its way into our natural waterways, into our creeks, our rivers, our lakes, our oceans. So one of the things we can do to help mitigate this is to have our landscape capture and retain what we call the first flush. Now, the first flush, appropriately named, it's the first big rainstorm that we get after a dry period, right? So during a dry period, we get an accumulation of all these different kind of pollutants. We get this big rainstorm and it washes all those pollutants away. Well, rather than sending all that water that falls onto your property out into the flood control system to pick up all these pollutants. Let's hold that in our landscape. And we can do that with a simple swale. All we mean by a swale is a depression in the landscape. So here's an example. You can see the swale that runs through this landscape. All we did was dig that depression out. We want to keep all soil on site. So we add all of that soil and we create different berms around our landscape. You can see here on both sides of the swale. And then what we did is we took this downspout, which used to deliver water right to the curbside drain and gone and off on its way. We cut that downspout and we have diverted it to deliver all that water that falls on this roof into that swale. Now, once that water enters that swale, because we've built this healthy living soil sponge, that water is absorbed very quickly by the soil, and that water then can be utilized by our plants for months and months to come, decreasing the need for irrigation. And then remember that that soil acts as a filter. So any pollutants that this water has picked up along the way are going to be sunk into the soil, and all those microorganisms are going to help to basically treat that water. And capture all those pollutants, holding all that water on site. Now, if you're thinking to yourself, well, maybe where we live, we don't get a lot of rain, or maybe where we live, we get a ton of rain. Well, it's a very easy calculation to figure out how much water your roof accumulates. And the formula for that, if you will, is that for every 1,000 square feet of roof area, a 1-inch rainstorm generates over 600 gallons of water. Right, so think about that. 1-inch rainstorm, 600 gallons of water. So if we have a typical residential roof, somewhere between 1,000 to 1,500 square feet, we're generating potentially, 6,000 to 12,000 gallons of water over a typical winter. Some of the areas around the United States are going to generate less. Some are going to generate a lot more. But the amount of rainwater falling on your roof can be a significant resource. Now, when it comes to the proof, you can see it right in front of your own eyes. Here's a landscape that was grass. We converted to a watershed wise landscape. You can see the downspout on the left there was cut and diverts into the swale. So that this landscape acts like a sponge. We got 4 inches of rain in the month of December here. We held on to over 1,600 gallons of water coming from the roof area. Very, very simple. And if you're looking at that water and you're thinking, yeah, stagnant water, mosquitoes, because we built this soil sponge, that water's gone within 24 to 48 hours. Now, some of you may be thinking, well, what about all that water on our roof? What if we store it in, say, a rain barrel? Well, rain barrels hold about, say, 45 gallons of water on average. Think about that 1-inch storm. We're generating over 600 gallons of water. So rain barrels, we like to think of them less as a storage device, but more as a slowing device. So in this example here, all the water from that roof comes down that rain chain. Rain chains are great. They look nice. They sound beautiful as the water's trickling down, but they also help to slow that water down. That water then fills up this rain barrel, right? After it fills up, though, we have an overflow spout at the top of that rain barrel connected to some kind of hose. So when the rain barrel fills up, the water then flows out the overflow to the hose. That hose then directs water into some part of our landscape. So rain barrels are great for kind of gathering water from the roof, slowing it down, and then helping to deliver that water to a different part of your landscape. Now, even when done right, some gardens are going to need additional water. Depending on when you installed this plant, there's a very important establishment period. As our climate continues to change, it's making our rainy seasons highly variable. And some plants, even local plants, are going to require water during these dry periods. So even when done right, we may need some of that additional watering. That transitions us right into managing our irrigation. Now, our typical lawn waters with spray sprinklers, and spray sprinklers have about the same flow rate as a shower head. Right? So think about it. Each one of those sprinklers is a shower head. So when we run our sprinklers on our grass, we're watering 20 to 30 gallons per minute. And this is just much too much water that's wasted on our landscapes. Now, if you are going to keep your grass, you want to make sure you're moving away from conventional spray sprinklers into something more efficient, like these multi-trajectory rotating nozzles that you see on the left here. It's very easy to switch these nozzles out. You twist the old nozzle off, twist the new nozzle on, you kind of adjust the throw of it, and that's it. Now you can see these water comes out in these different fingers. This allows for a much slower flow rate so that your grass and your soil has a better chance of absorbing all that water. The water also comes out in bigger droplets, so those droplets have a better chance of getting to the grass and therefore the surface of your soil. If you've got a nice big grass area, then rotors are also going to be a great way to water as well. So if you're going to keep your grass, make sure you're watering it as efficiently as possible by switching away from conventional spray to these other more efficient methods of irrigation. Now, better than that is switching to drip irrigation. So where you can, any kind of shrub areas or trees, we encourage you to switch to drip. You're going to basically, dramatically increase the efficiency of your irrigation system from, say, 50% to 90% very, very quickly by switching. You want to make sure you're hydro zoning by irrigation type. We talked about that earlier, right plant in the right place and grouping those plants together based on water need. You also need to make sure you're grouping those plants together based on irrigation method. So even though we have, say a high water user for grass and a high water user for edibles, if we're watering with different irrigation methods, such as spray and drip, we have to have them on separate irrigation valves. You cannot water spray irrigation on the same as drip or spray on the same as rotating nozzles or anything like that. So we need to make sure we're separating those zones based on irrigation method as well. One thing to consider is if you've got some really large shrubs or you've got trees, is actually putting them on their own hydro zone. You can put them on their own drip irrigation. You can form concentric rings, just like the ones that you see here. These are going to be especially beneficial to help keep your trees and your large shrubs alive if we go into times of drought or decreased irrigation or things like that. If you're going to be installing drip irrigation, you want to make sure you add new low flow valves. These new low flow valves are designed to function optimally with your drip lines, which are very, very slow flow rates. These low flow valves typically come in a kit with a built-in filter and a built-in pressure regulator as well. Those are two essential features when it comes to drip irrigation. If you've got old or leaking valves, it's a great idea to replace these. These, I can tell you, are leaking 24/7. That ends up being a significant amount of water over the course of a month or a year. The water that's leaking down these valves also encourages roots to come in and grow around these valves and your pipes, which can cause more problems. So replace any kinds of leaking or old valves. Make sure you have your pressure in check. If you turn your sprinklers on and they're kind of just misting the air, that's how you know your pressure is too high. You mist the air, the water's blown away. You're literally paying for water that's just increasing the relative humidity in your area. Another thing with pressure is if it's too low, it affects the coverage. And so you end up with lots of dead spots throughout your lawn as well. So make sure you get your pressure in check when it comes to your sprinklers, as well as your drip irrigation. Make sure when you turn your system on, take a walk around and fix any problems, any broken heads, any sunken heads. I see sprinklers all the time that are simply just pointed in the wrong direction. And then, of course, make sure you're irrigating during the right time. So follow your local municipalities' requirements that they may have for irrigation. But generally speaking, we want to water in the early mornings or the late evenings where the sun is not out, temperatures are cooler, and it's typically going to be less windy. If available, better yet is to use a local watering calculator. So look up your local water agency or your utility district or local municipalities, your city, see if they have any kind of watering calculator where they take local weather data, types of plants, types of soil, types of irrigation, and they help to create an irrigation schedule for you. Some of them you're going to plug in the info and it's going to spit out a schedule like this. There are other examples in other cities and other states where they kind of give you general guidelines of the water use of plants. In this example from Oregon, you can see we've got high, moderate, and low water users with different types of irrigation and how long to run these irrigations for your highest water month of the year, which is going to be, say, July. Another way to improve the efficiency of your existing sprinkler system is to making sure you're adjusting your sprinkler timer seasonally so that when spring comes along, we've adjusted our sprinkler system to say 70% of what we would water during the highest months of say July and August. then reducing that irrigation even further as we move into fall and September, and then of course turning that system off and winterizing it as we move into those cold, freezing months, and then repeating it again. Another way to improve the efficiency of your existing system is to implement what we call a cycle and soak. So if you're watering your lawn, and you notice within about 4 or 5 minutes, you start to get a lot of runoff. Well, that becomes what we call your max runtime. If you don't know your max runtime, well, simply turn your sprinklers on and start a timer and go out and watch. Now, whenever your grass fills up, like that sponge we talk about, right? Your grass fills up pretty quickly. Typically, the quality of your soil is pretty poor. When that fills up, any water that we're paying for, that we are irrigating with, is going to now run off, right? So we want to stop that runoff. So let's say we conduct the runoff test, we see 4 minutes. Well, if we know we need to water for say 8 minutes, we can implement what we call this cycle and soak, where we're going to water for 4 minutes. We know that's our max runtime. We're going to wait an hour to allow that water to absorb, and then we're going to run for an additional 4 minutes so that we meet our 8-minute requirement for that day, but we give that soil time for that water to absorb. So I strongly encourage you all to conduct that runoff time test. And if you need to, then implement what we call a cycle and soak. Now, if that sounds like a lot, plugging your information in a timer, having to go out there and adjust your sprinkler timer, if you don't have time for it, if it's not a priority, then I strongly encourage you to look into what we call a weather-based controller. These smart timers, if you will, they either have their own weather station or they connect to a local network of weather stations, and they adjust your sprinkler schedule for you. So when it's cooler, they water less. When it's warmer, they water more. And if it's raining, they don't water at all. So look for irrigation controllers that have the WaterSense label, and consider upgrading to what we call a smart timer or a weather-based irrigation controller. A lot of these new models, which is great, are programmable from anywhere. A lot of them have a little app you can download. You can plug all your information in there. You can operate it. You can control it from wherever you are. And then depending on what type of landscape you're installing, you may consider just capping your irrigation system and just hand watering certain sections of your garden. If you're focusing on mostly native plants, once you get through that establishment period, we oftentimes don't have to irrigate at all. And depending on where you live, consider a gray water system. A gray water system takes that gently used water from, say, your sinks and diverts it over into your irrigation system and allows you to then water your plants outside. Now, before moving forward with the gray water system, make sure you check your local municipality. There are certain limitations when it comes to permitting and installation. Lastly, here, we're going to wrap up with managing our landscapes. Now, every garden, no matter what type of garden, is going to continue to need, less landscape maintenance, but it's going to continue to need maintenance in order to be happy and healthy. There is no such thing as a zero maintenance garden. When you first convert your landscape, if you're switching from grass to a low water, or you're just improving your existing landscape, stay on top of grass growth and weed regrowth. Right? The goal here, though, when you see this, is minimize soil disturbances. So if you've got weeds, you can simply cut the weeds off at the base and add a little bit of compost to that area. If you've got warm season grass, especially growing back, make sure you pull that grass out completely, get those roots out, add some compost into that part of the soil you disturbed, and then move the mulch back to kind of cover that part of your area. You'll find when you have mulch, the weeds that do grow back are very easy to pull right out, especially if you get them quickly and don't let them get too established. If you've got existing grass you're going to keep, aerate your lawn in the spring. Make sure you're aerating with one of those tools that pulls out those plugs. Leave those plugs. They're going to break down very quickly. All those nutrients, all that soil, we want to keep it on site. One thing that I like to do specifically when I do aerate in the spring is I then go out and I throw a bunch of compost or worm castings on the surface of the grass. You can even put that organic matter directly into some of those holes throughout your landscape as well. This is going to be a very healthy way to maintain your grass organically and naturally. Any areas where you don't have vegetation directly covering it, such as say grass and shrubs, you want to make sure you're mulching with 3 to 4 inches during all times. Remember that that mulch is going to keep out the weeds and grass. It's going to help retain that water, and that mulch is going to break down over time to provide organic matter into the soil. And then, of course, the best mulch is the free mulch, and that is the leaves that are dropped by your trees and shrubs fall on the ground. That becomes your mulch. So over time, you're not having to buy mulch, you're not having to replace mulch because your landscape is going to do that naturally. And then lastly here, don't prune too much when it comes to your plants. Pruning encourages plant water use, so you really want to plan for the right reasons. If you've got areas of the shrub or tree that are dead, diseased, damaged, or deranged. And what we mean by deranged is that branch now growing across your walkway that you're having to do the limbo underneath to get to, say, your front door. But make sure you're pruning for the right reasons during the right time of the year as well when you can. Now, when it comes to managing your landscape irrigation, stay on top of any kind of changes in your irrigation programming. So new plants, establishing plants, making those as seasonal adjustments, and of course, turning that system off when we get some rainfall wherever you are. Make sure you're out there turning your sprinkler system on every quarter or at least twice a year to check for leaks, right? Check soil moisture, make sure your drip tubes haven't moved, make sure your emitters are where you want them to be, make sure your spray sprinklers are pointed in the right direction. Make those little adjustments that are going to help save a lot of water over the course of time. One thing you can invest in is a soil probe. This allows you to stab down into the soil, pull up a profile of your soil column so you can see what's going on. Areas of compaction, how deep are my roots growing? How deep is that water? Is there still water there? Should I water right now? So watering this does not grow anything, and watering this doesn't grow anything. Maybe it helps some weeds grow in the middle of those areas, but it doesn't help anything grow. And that wraps up our Watershed Wise landscape training. So what your new landscape looks like could look like a million different ways, whether you want more of kind of a natural wildland look, whether you want something that's maybe a little more modern, right? A little more Mediterranean look. All of these different landscapes have dramatically different looks. They're all in different areas throughout the United States, but they all function in the same way. All of these landscapes have built a healthy living soil sponge. All of these landscapes have a plan to capture rainwater. All of these landscapes have plants that are native to the area or plants that are adapted and are going to do well, plants that we call climate appropriate. And all of these landscapes have irrigation. Well, some of them don't, but the ones that do have irrigation, we are irrigating as efficiently as possible and only when necessary. This is a particular example I want to point out. That beautiful Japanese maple in the middle there kind of acts as an accent bush. That is a higher water user in a low water landscape. So we may need to say hand water if we want to keep that one around. So long as we're capturing water, we're creating that soil sponge, we're storing that water in our landscape, it can look like anything. Here's an example where we had an area difficult to maintain, 2 million gallons of water used per year. We transformed this landscape into local native grasses, other local native shrubs. We created a decomposed granite pathway that allows water to be absorbed, and we dropped water use from 2 million gallons a year to 200,000 gallons a year. Here's some other landscapes from different parts of the United States, focusing on those native plants that kind of function well in the beauty of that urban wildlife interface, that still create that beautiful look that we want, that still create the function that we so desperately need when it comes to regenerating our soils, when it comes to planting plants that are going to be happy and healthy, holding on to rainwater, having different features. You can also have little water features in your landscape, such as bird baths or fountains that recycle that water. Lastly, here, where do we go from here? Well, make sure you check out the other resources on our website. Make sure you check out the pamphlet that's specifically associated with this Watershed Wise basic when it comes to that. Check out the different landscape guidelines that we have. We have all kinds of different guidebooks from different parts throughout the United States. And continue your Watershed Wise training. Look at the other trainings that we've got. Make sure you check out those supplemental materials as well. I mentioned the Watershed Wise or the WaterSense label. Make sure you look for that label on any kind of products. The WaterSense website also has a great tool for finding a landscape professional as well. So we're going to be providing these links for you, but you can also look them up on EPA's water website as well. So where do we go from here? Take our other classes, experiment with your own landscape. Get out there, turn on your irrigation, transform it, tell your friends, tell your family. And with that, I want to thank you for watching this Watershed Wise Landscape training. I hope you're inspired. I hope you learned a lot. Remember, from here, the sky's the limit, and I hope to see you in some other classes. Thank you very much.